The newsagents.
My government will act to keep communities safe from crime, antisocial behaviour, terrorism and illegal migration. A bill will be brought forward to ensure tougher sentences.
That was King Charles addressing Parliament as the monarch, the first king to do so in a state opening of Parliament since his grandfather did it in 1951, over 70 years ago. It is a chance for the government and the Prime Minister, even though it is the King's speech, it is effectively the Prime Minister's speech. He and his government write it. It's a chance for them to set the agenda for the coming year, a chance of which there are increasingly few to relaunch and recast Rishi Sunak's prospects.
And today we're going to tell you a little bit about what was in that speech and what we're expecting to see change in government, and also what was left out. And perhaps that's the most interesting bit of all. Welcome to the newsagents.
It's Lewis.
It's Emily. And a little bit later in today's episode, we're going to be in South Carolina on the trail of their former governor, Nikki Haley. She is now tied second in the Republican race to be president. All eyes are on her. If anything happens to Donald Trump, she could very well be the Republican nominee for president.
But first we are, as we said, going to talk about the King's speech. We should start, Emily. I mean, do you think you were the only person in Georgia listening to the King's speech this morning? Was there a little bar? People playing beer pong?
There was a big screen up in the park. Many thousands were gathered there.
Well, right.
Baseball caps, beers. It's a big Georgia annual event here at 6.
Well, it's a state
a.m.
It's a state named after the King's great grandfather or whatever it is. So, you know, it's just as well.
Imagine what it's like in Charleston. You can only guess.
Well, you were in South Carolina, so you can tell us later, right? In terms of what was in this speech, I mean, just to rewind a little bit, because we kind of talk about it as if everybody kind of knows what it is and as if it's just totally normal, because it's not. It is this weird thing, this weird part of the kind of parliamentary year where Parliament is prorogued, which people now have rather different associations with after the illegal Boris Johnson one. But normally it's just a short prorogation from the old session of Parliament, i.e. one of the years of Parliament, effectively. And then Parliament reassembles, and the King, or the monarch, formerly the Queen, the King, now opens Parliament for the year ahead. And he has to read out a speech which is written for him by the government of the day, which sets out their priorities for the coming legislative year ahead. And this, of course, will be the last full legislative year of this Parliament. So like I was saying, it is an opportunity. It's supposed to be. I mean, I'm actually not really sure. We can talk about this, that it ever really is. But it is supposed to be. It is often billed as a chance for the government to relaunch itself, to re-establish itself. And obviously this is Rishi Sunak's first full one as Prime Minister. And so the reason why, and I saw some people sort of commenting on Twitter earlier saying, why does he sound so bored? Like, Charles never sounds bored. He's normally got a lot to say. Well, the point is because although it's a speech in his name, it is not his words, and it is something that whatever the Prime Minister and the government of the day writes, he has to read out. So in a way, he's supposed to sound bored. And just to take you through some of the and that way at least no one can say he supports it or doesn't. And we know there are definitely things in this that he definitely wouldn't support. So there are things in it like the opportunity for firms to exploit new oil and gas in the North Sea. The big stuff that was trailed was around new and tougher sentences for offenders. That was very well trailed in the papers over the last couple of days. There was a bill on reforming leasehold law for new homes that are built, basically trying to phase out or modify the way leasehold works after all of the leasehold scandals. And there were a couple of other smaller things as well, much of which was trailed in the party conference speech. So a tobacco and vaping bill, which will introduce a phase ban on smoking, a new regulator for English football, rather bizarrely a pedicabs bill, which will give Transport for London new powers to regulate pedal-powered taxi cabs in the capital, and a few other things like a Holocaust memorial bill, which will enable a Holocaust memorial to be built in Victoria Tower Gardens. And overall, there were no kind of rabbits, there were no surprises. It had all been very well trailed. It built on stuff that Sunak was talking about in the party conference speech. And it actually, as a matter of fact, had the fewest bills in a monarch speech, Queen's speech or King's speech since 2014.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, because I think if you compare and contrast to when the Queen was giving the Queen's speech, as it were, of course she's still reading out what the government of the day has set in front of her. But I think we knew so little about the Queen's thoughts because she'd been on the throne for so long that you were always left slightly guessing as to what her real feelings were, unless it involved sort of, horses or dogs. But I think with King Charles, we know him. This is a monarch that we have grown to know and grown to understand politically over the last sort of 50, 60 years. And so I think everyone was really acutely tuned into wondering how his voice would sound when he said this bill will support the future licensing of new oil and gas fields. He doesn't approve of that. Everything
crown almost fell off.
I know. It's that moment where he's like, do not show any emotion, do not pause, do not speed up, do not slow down, because I think all eyes are on him for precisely that reason. We know the things that he really doesn't like, and it's quite memorable that when he met Liz Truss, the one bit that went viral was him going, oh dear, not again, which may or may not have had anything to do with Liz Truss, but occasionally we get these glimpses into King Charles's inner life. So I think even for him just to have got through it in what you called a boring tone was probably something of success for him. But I guess, you've talked about whether there was a rabbit or not. The rabbit kind of got away. It sort of crept out and ran off into a field. And I'm talking about Suella Braverman's plans, what she wanted to see in the King's speech, which was this incredibly extraordinary idea of removing tents from homeless people. And it wasn't just that, it was sort of other ideas, including her plan to create a new civil offence to deter charities from giving tents to homeless people. Actually making that a civil offence, and none of that was included in what we heard from the King today. So if that bit of homelessness is gone, you might even say, Suella's homeless bill is now homeless. It did not have a place in the King's speech today, which suggests something, I think, fairly profound now about the relationship between Suella and her Prime Minister. Why do we know all those details so clearly? Presumably because we heard them directly from the Home Secretary's mouth. Why are they not in the final draft of this speech? Presumably because the Prime Minister doesn't really like them.
Yeah, and I think there is now an open question which is being talked about more and more in Westminster about Suella Braverman's future and what her strategy is. Look, everybody knows that this is a woman who is positioning herself repeatedly and sustainedly about the Tory leadership post-election. And although it is true to say that Braverman has had some utility politically and strategically for Sunak in saying things and doing things that he doesn't want to say and doesn't want to do, and that she reaches part of the Conservative electorate and party that maybe he doesn't, and therefore she has some utility. I think there's got to be an increasing question about whether or not Braverman is simply trying to get sacked and whether Braverman is trying to get moved, because she pushes the boundaries, and she is pushing the boundaries, and not just on what she said about homelessness, which clearly didn't have Number 10's support, and those proposals clearly didn't have Number 10's authorisation. Otherwise, as you say, Emily, they would have been in this speech. But she is doing it almost week by week now. She's, in terms of how she's described the hate marches around in Gaza, for example, and there are countless other examples as well. So I think there has to be simply a question as to whether she is trying to push Number 10 to the point where their patience exhausts or is snapped. Because, of course, we know that if she were to be moved, or whether she were to be sacked at some point, she would become a martyr to the Conservative cause. She would become a bigger threat on the backbenches than she is internally, and she would be even better placed than she is right now in an opposition situation post-election. So I think that there has just got to be a question mark about what she is trying to do and how much patience Number 10 will show her.
Yeah, she's got form on this in a way. Don't forget that it was her resignation that kind of triggered Liz Truss's resignation when she was Home Secretary, I can't believe I'm going to say this, last time round. So she basically, self-flagellated over a security breach on emails, which I don't think at the time ever really rung that true. Did it?
Well, I think what it was is there were so many other like sort of profound crises going on at the time that it almost sort of slipped by the by. Yeah, exactly. It just sort of, it had a lifespan as a news story of about 45 seconds. But
it all ties into the same thing, which was, did her resignation last time pave the way? Did it basically trigger Liz Truss's resignation because it suggested there wasn't really confidence in the Prime Minister? Once you take the security and the emails thing out of the picture, it basically meant she didn't trust Liz Truss. And also the fact that she became that kingmaker, in a sense, when Boris Johnson, famously on that Sunday night after he flew back from the Caribbean and we thought he was about to enter the race, it later emerged that Suella Braverman was part of the team that said, right, we will back you, Rishi Sunak, but make sure that I get, a key job in your cabinet. And Rishi Sunak was faced with this slightly horrifying prospect at the time, like, why do I have to have her in my cabinet, was the story I heard, because she's the one that's going to land you the premiership. And so I think that relationship between the two of them has always been uneasy. And quite often she has spoken over the heads of cabinet colleagues to, not least, to a Washington audience, for example,
totally.
To a sort of sense of people in the country at home, whether or not, her own party agreed with what she was actually saying, or the fact that she was saying it on a stage at the Conservative Party conference. She's always been in this slightly odd spot, which is, my message to real people is stronger than you can ever possibly know. Don't get in my way.
Yeah, and look, I think that, as we've spoken about on the show before, the kind of policy differences between Sunak and Braverman in some ways are not that great. They are actually at one, particularly on many of the issues around immigration and so on. I think the question is about tone, particularly at a time, and you could see it from this speech in some ways, when the Conservative Party is increasingly concerned about its seats, its more liberal seats in southern England, about a potential threat to the Lib Dems, for example, and then wanting to kind of tone down some of the culture war stuff, tone down some of the aggression, but also just a question about freestyling and whether you can have a senior cabinet minister who seems so often repeatedly to flout or to question or to push the boundaries of her own authority and therefore the authority of the Prime Minister as well. There has to be a hierarchy, and I think there is increasingly a feeling that Braverman is at least getting to the edge of where she can be from within the cabinet. So, there's obviously something to watch. In terms of what else was left out in the speech, though, there were a few other things that I think could potentially cause Sunak some problems with his own backbenchers over the next sort of couple of weeks and months. There was no new bill to ban the import of hunting trophies. That had previously been indicated that would be coming after a Tory MP's bill to do so was timed out in the last parliamentary session. That's actually something, those sort of environmental things actually have a kind of weird well, not weird, but a kind of strong salience in parts of the Conservative backbenches and Conservative Party, and he could get some pressure. It's the sort of thing that you can start to see sort of internet campaigns start to arise on. And also a bill to introduce a ban on so-called conversion therapy to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. That has been going back and forth and promised and unpromised and promised again within the Tory party since 2018. And again is something that quite a few Conservative backbenchers feel very, very strongly about. And it's one of those couple of issues, those kind of like sort of sleeper issues, can really end up coming out of nowhere to sort of derail a Prime Minister at a future point.
Yeah, and two things that were in the bill, just to pick up on one thing that you were saying at the beginning, we heard from the King, let's say from Rishi Sunak, from the government, that they're committed to tackling anti-Semitism and ensuring the Holocaust never forgotten. And he said the bill would progress the memorial and the educational building that's built in Victoria Gardens. And I think, there has been some unease, to be honest, about this, which is that there are some people in the Jewish community who kind of have seen, over the last few weeks, what has happened, for example, with the posters being ripped down, taken from the walls, those of the kidnapped victim, and sort of don't really want to put something so visible and so central into people's eye lines at a time like this, because it is proving I think, more controversial than anyone could ever have imagined that it would, you know, when the idea of a Holocaust memorial was first introduced. The other line I found slightly curious was about legislation being introduced to protect public places from terrorism in the light of the Manchester Arena attack. And I'm really trying to work out what that means, or whether two things have been sort of elided there. The Manchester Arena attack, you know, I remember I covered it, I was there, was horrendous, horrific. And there were security breaches and there were problems with, you know, the amount of time that responders took to get there. But I'm not sure what you would have done in terms of protecting public places to stop that happening. I'm trying to work out what that actually means. And I wonder whether it's more to do with stopping protest or stopping public areas being used for protest, and they've sort of thrown in the terrorism idea as a way of saying this, you know, this would have stopped the arena bombing. I just don't see how those two actually go together, because the bombing of the arena was done from inside and it was utterly horrific, and you hope that, you know, bag checks and all the rest of it would have been better. But I don't get why that would necessarily have been something that you would be able to do to protect public places.
Yeah, I suppose the sort of big question going into this is that, and the thing that a lot of the kind of media commentary around it was sort of suggesting, was to say, oh, this is a big opportunity for Rishi Sunak to kind of relaunch, to get on the front foot at one of an increasingly few opportunities as we get towards the next general election. So I suppose if we're to take that at face value, then the question has to be, well, has that succeeded? And that is like clearly no, in the sense that there was nothing new in this speech. Much of it had already been prepared in terms of the party conference. But I would say that kind of, I think that was always with a King's speech or a Queen's speech, it's always kind of the wrong way to look at it, right? In the sense that, look, it is not a particularly great PR opportunity for you as a government to decide to try and relaunch policies or relaunch your government through the medium of a monarch who is supposed to sound bored when they're giving the speech in a constitutional ceremony that most people do not understand, and why should they, and pay very little attention to, even if they do. So this was always going to be, it wasn't going to be a relaunch moment. I think what it shows us, though, is that the policies which the Prime Minister did try to relaunch his premiership around and on, and the moment he did have was party conference. And those things that he announced, the sort of big things, as we remember, and we covered on the show at the time, you know, the smoking ban for young people, future A-level reform, scrapping HS2, none of it has really landed. None of it has really worked. And what Conservative MPs are, who are actually fighting the next election, are increasingly anxious about is that they have very little to go to their constituents and say that they have, and say that they're delivering, and say, promise them for the next election. That there's very little opportunity for them as they exercise their shoe leather going around their constituencies up to the next election. Very little in the way of retail offer. And that is what they're worried about with Sunak, that he doesn't have the political chops for it, that the big things around which he's braced his premiership so far just haven't worked. What we've heard from Sunak today has been to basically say, mission accomplished, or we're getting towards mission accomplished, in terms of the 5 priorities that he set. This was a video where I have to say I think he sounds sort of almost as bored as the King that he put out on the Downing Street Twitter feed earlier today.
We're taking long-term decisions to deliver a brighter future. First, we're going to grow the economy, create jobs, improve skills, and back our brilliant innovators and entrepreneurs. Second, we're going to strengthen society, including protecting young people from smoking by creating the first smoke-free generation and delivering a better deal for renters and leaseholders. Third, we're going to keep people safe, giving the police and the security services the power they need and criminals the punishments they deserve. Finally, we're going to protect our national interests by backing our brilliant armed forces and veterans and standing up for our values and interests on the world stage. We're determined to take the long-term decisions to build a better future, to create a Britain that's more prosperous, more innovative and more secure. And that's what this King's speech will deliver.
I've never heard anyone sadder about delivering a brighter future. It It is extraordinary. But I guess going back to your question about the retail offering, we know what Conservative MPs want to offer on the doorstep, and that's a tax cut, right? They're all dying to be able to say, we're going into the next election doing what Labour can't promise, and that's a tax cut. It might just be that they were deliberately keeping this boring because Jeremy Hunt is finding a bit of headroom for his autumn speech in 2 weeks' time, where he does get to make that announcement. And maybe that's where the firepower will finally come, and that's what gives them, something to go into the next election. Or maybe we won't hear about that for about 6 months. But I feel like almost guaranteeing you that before we go to the polls, there will be the promise from the Prime Minister in some shape or form of a tax cut, and that's going to be the only way he gets his MPs to knock on those doors ahead of the election.
Although, if I were a Tory MP hoping for that, and as you say, Emily, the autumn statement's coming, and that is a far better opportunity to relaunch or to try and turn your political fortunes around than a King's Speech, which is basically just a constitutional nicety. Autumn statement, a proper fiscal event where you can actually do some stuff. But one of the last things that Charles said, and I thought that this was sort of telling.
Charles, as he knows.
Charles, Chuck,
really?
Chuck, as I call him. We're always going around for tea. Me, Chucky, and Camilla. One of the last things that he said, and I thought it was notable that it was sort of reiterated at the end. He said, "My ministers will address inflation and the drivers of low growth over demands for greater spending or borrowing." And of course, more spending or more borrowing. That seemed to me to be a point of emphasis directed squarely at Conservative backbenchers who are agitating all of the time for tax cuts. I think the big question basically about, not so much about this King's Speech, but about over the next 12 months is, there wasn't that much in this King's Speech. There weren't that many bills in this King's Speech. Strategically, if you're number 10, why would you put loads of bills in it? Basically, if you've got any good ideas, the opposition will just agree with them up until the next election. It won't really create dividing lines because they'll just accept them. That's something like the Criminal Justice Bill, which has been well trailed. Labour aren't going to oppose any of that. They're going to basically, or at least not in the sort of broad principles, they'll basically go along with much of that. The question more is, does Sunak have any ideas that he is keeping in his back pocket for the election and the election campaign when it does come? And the fear for Conservative MPs, frankly, is that he doesn't, that this isn't strategic, that he has run out of steam insofar as he had any in the first place.
In a moment, we're going to be deep in South Carolina. That's the home state of Nikki Haley. She is on the up in the polls, and many in her party, the Republican Party, are starting to wonder if something big happens to Donald Trump, could she be the one to take them through to the presidency? Well, yesterday, if you were listening to the newsagents, we were talking about the brand new polling that had come out showing that Trump was cutting quite a substantial lead over Biden in some of these key swing states. And also in that polling was something that most of us missed, which was that Nikki Haley gets an even bigger lead over Joe Biden than Donald Trump. Who is Nikki Haley? Well, she is also running to be president for the Republican Party. She's a former South Carolina governor. She was a UN ambassador. She's woven this slightly precarious line between supporting Trump and reminding everyone that they didn't win the popular vote under Trump and he's lost the last few elections that he's actually stood for. And so she is now creeping into this second place steadily but impressively. She is now joint second in the race to be the Republican nominee along with Ron DeSantis. And she's the voice that people who like Trump's policies but just don't like all the baggage that come with Trump are starting to talk about now as being an alternative. If, whisper it quietly, Trump were convicted, could Nikki Haley be the person that took the Republican Party to the presidency? So we went on an adventure to South Carolina, to a tiny little town of Bamberg, which is where she was born, where she grew up. It is a Truman Show style set of immaculate lawns and rocking chairs on the porches. And we spoke to childhood friends and to people who literally remember the day Nikki Haley was born and who delivered her. But we're going to start with Nikki Haley's campaign launch for the presidency.
The railroad tracks divided the town by race. I was the proud daughter of Indian immigrants. Not black, not white. I was different. But my mom would always say your job is not to focus on the differences, but the similarities. Some people look at America and see vulnerability. They all think we can be bullied, kicked around. You should know this about me. I don't put up with bullies. And when you kick back, it hurts them more if you're wearing heels. I'm Nikki Haley, and I'm running for president.
We're just approaching Nikki Haley's childhood town of Bamberg. We're an hour inside the state of South Carolina now. It all feels a bit different. We've left the big Georgia highway behind and it feels kind of small town. There are fields of cotton on the side, literally southern cotton that is being picked right now in the autumn harvest. We just arrived in Bamberg and we've headed straight for City Hall. Now, take away all those thoughts of what a City Hall might look like in your mind's eye. This is a one-storey building on the main road, and we're about to meet Mayor Nancy Foster, or Miss Nancy, as they call her here.
Bamberg is just nice people, church-going people, a lot of Christians here.
And Bamberg's now on the political map because it's the hometown of Nikki Haley.
Yeah, absolutely.
And she was your governor, the South Carolina governor.
Absolutely, she was. She's moving up. We're excited about it. Oh, she's a lovely lady. She was born here in our hospital right here. Dr. Watson delivered her in 1972. So we're pretty excited about what's going on with Nikki Haley.
Do you remember her as a little girl?
I do. Her family had a dress shop here called Exotica, and we all shopped there, and the children were in the shop. So we really had a good relationship. But yeah, all the boys claim now that they had, she had a crush. My son-in-law, in fact, says that they're about the same age, my son-in-law. He says that she had a crush on him, but I think it might have been the other way around.
In her campaign video, she describes that odd feeling that this was a town that had a lot of African Americans and it had a lot of white residents, and she didn't quite know where she fitted in, that she wasn't one or the other. She didn't know whether to call herself black or white.
I know she talks about that, but I just don't remember that. I mean, they were welcomed. You knew they were Indian, but they were just welcomed here. The young people treated her just like any other. But, as a child, you don't always remember things the way they really were.
Nikki Haley's campaign video puts her walking along a disused railway track, talking about what it's like to grow up where you're of mixed heritage, Indian, Asian heritage, not really knowing if you belonged to the white side of the community or the black side of the community. But the people we've spoken to here in Bamberg say, gently, as the Queen might once have said, recollections may differ. They say that the family was entirely included and she always seemed to be very much part of whatever was going on here. Now, both things can be true, but I wonder if there is a narrative forming around Nikki Haley for president in which her difference and the way she has crossed a racial divide becomes more important to the story now than it ever might have felt to those around her when she was a child. We're about to meet Sharon Carter. Now, Sharon's family and Nikki Haley's family were close when they were kids. Their brother and sister played together. And Sharon, just to put Sharon Carter in context, is running for the state Senate. She's a big fan of Nikki Haley. She thinks it's time for a woman, but if you prod her a little bit further, honestly, she still thinks that Trump is going to win, even here. So do you know all these people still?
I do not anymore.
No, okay.
It's a different. Some have stayed, but our generation, say it like that, but our parents' generation, they're here or they've passed away.
Sharon, you've known Nikki Haley and her family since she was a little girl, right?
Right, since, well, middle school, for sure, yeah.
And what was she like?
She was just always the most polite, friendly, such a studious student. There can't be a single person that could tell you something in a negative way about her.
So what did you get a sense from her then of her drive or her ambition, or I mean, what is she like doing?
I mean, I knew that she was good at math, and so her to be an accountant was not surprising. But I mean, no one here would know that she would go into politics the way, or by any means become our president. But anything she's put her mind to, she can do. I actually know that she would do the best job as president, but I'm also a realist, and so numbers are saying that somebody's going to be second to Trump. But with all the drama that has been surrounded around, I say let's pick the person that's always done exactly what they say they're going to do. She does what she says, and she says what she means, because she's never wavered in anything she's ever said. Whatever she said, she's done. She's proven it. She's the same exact person she was when she was 12 years old.
Sharon, does this still feel like Nikki Haley's Bamberg? I mean, would everyone here support her over, let's say, Donald Trump in the South Carolina primary?
No, unfortunately, this isn't Nikki Haley's Bamberg anymore, because there are local folks who say, well, she was governor. Why didn't she change the dynamics and the direction of her town as governor? So they see the success that Donald Trump had in making America great again and bringing industry. And so they're basing it on his record of how to bring industry back. This is Trump town.
The truth is that here in the heart of Bamberg, the little town which is so proud to call itself Nikki Haley's hometown, where even the mayor can name the hospital and the obstetrician who delivered her, where people have pictures of her in their windows and signs with her name, even here the numbers tell us that she would lose out to Donald Trump. The thing to realise about Nikki Haley is she's played a very quiet, very strategic game here. She knows she's not going to beat Donald Trump whilst he's in the race, but on one hypothetical, Donald Trump ends up being convicted, and she then slides into the race as a slightly more palatable figure for many than Ron DeSantis, who is seen as a sort of Trump-like character. Nikki Haley is deeply conservative. She is deeply traditional. She is very hardline on immigration, on abortion. She is not really, in policy terms, a softer version of Donald Trump at all. She just comes with fewer of his problems. She's also seen as an internationalist. Her experience with the UN means that she is sort of given credit for understanding America's position vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine and China and even the Middle East. I guess there are many in the Republican Party who, quite frankly, would tell you that they could very much imagine a world in which she was the nominee, because she could deliver what he delivers. According to these polls, she would actually do better than Trump in many of the places that the Republicans so desperately need to win next time round. But I don't think you'll get anyone saying it out loud whilst Donald Trump is in the race. It is just too fragile for his ego to hear that, and people are treading so delicately within the party around how they feel about Donald Trump. They're not really saying out loud yet that they don't want it to be him.
Yeah, I mean, look, as we were saying yesterday, I mean, on paper, you know, this should be a Republican's election to lose, right? Biden is a really weak incumbent. So many of the headwinds are against him. And yet, actually, although Trump is clearly, partly because Biden, as we were saying yesterday, is so weak, that Trump does have a decent chance, many of the other Republicans, particularly Haley, who in many ways is a far more traditional kind of presidential figure, would be doing far better, as you were saying, Emily. And I think the question, though, of course, is that in the kind of doomsday scenario for the Republicans, that Trump is the nominee, as everyone expects, but that he goes down at some point next year for one of the lawsuits against him, for one of the trials in which he's going to be taking part, particularly the one with regards to election interference in the state that you're in, then what happens? And can he still be the candidate? Can there be a mechanism to remove him from being the candidate, to get another candidate? And the question then is as well, is Haley, who is sort of, to some extent at least, marking her case or building her case as being against Trump, despite the fact she served in his cabinet in his first administration, could she be the repository, or could she be the person who could be that second place, who could step in those circumstances, when the base, who presumably would be furious that this had happened to Trump, would want basically someone who looks like and sounds like and is as close to Trump as possible, and someone who is as angry as they are about his conviction. And that is, I suppose, where someone like Vivek or someone in that sort of ilk is trying to position themselves, as opposed to Haley or Christie or whoever.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look at that last line of her campaign video, where she just throws out, just reminds you that she's in heels. In other words, could it be the Republican Party that ended up having the first female president of America? Could it be the Republican Party that had the first Asian American woman as president? That is something that they could lean into. You know, they could actually lean into and say, as I think the Conservatives have done here, you know, you Dems, you call yourself progressives, but we're the ones that actually make the change. But I think what you've said is absolutely right, that there is such a, well, we don't know how big the base, but there is such a vocal base of angry Trump men out here who just don't want to see anything happen to him, and they will probably get in the way of the Republican Party ever changing its views on who they want as the nominee.
Yeah, and presumably one of the inflection points of that circumstance would be that anybody who was trying to become the nominee in his stead would have to promise to pardon him in order to get the votes. That would be the dynamic that would be at play there in that kind of like Armageddon scenario. But I just wanted to check before we go on. I mean, did you feed the alligator? Did you heed the advice?
Do you know what? We were convinced that that sign was a joke. And so we actually Googled the South Carolina alligator feeding law, and it's absolutely spot on. You are not allowed to feed the alligators in South Carolina. So,
well, I'm glad you verified that. That's news you can use for the news agents listeners there.
Absolutely. Put that one in the King's Speech.
Put that one in the King's Speech. I didn't hear about anything about that, did you?
No,
we are going to take a break now, but I've got some good news for you. We're going to be hearing from John Sopel, who has decided that he's been a little bit jealous, I think, of not getting to interview any Americans. So he's interviewed one of his own in Paris. Okay, well, as promised, obviously, Emily, you're in America, and our very own John Sopel is not in America. He's actually, I think, chairing an event or a conference this week. But I think he's been a bit upset. He's felt a little bit left out. I don't know whether because I was on holiday in America, you've been working in America. So he's tracked down some poor, unsuspecting American politician and shoved a microphone in his face. In this case, the mayor of Detroit, Mike Duggan. And he has been speaking to him for mainly the News Agents USA show. But we're going to give you, just so he doesn't feel left out, a little snippet of that interview now.
One of the things that I think is going to be a really interesting factor in the next election, and the way it could upend certain calculations, is what's happening in the Middle East right now. You're the mayor of Detroit. Michigan has one of the highest American Muslim populations in the country. And they're really angry with Joe Biden over the stance he's taking, aren't they?
There is a lot of frustration, anger, and it comes from something you can understand, which is the U.S. government has not been supportive of Palestinians' grievances for decades. And what has happened with this recent development is America and most of the world was outraged at Hamas's terrorist attacks on innocent Israelis. But now that you're seeing the war killing innocent Palestinians in Gaza, the feelings are running very deep in the Middle Eastern community in the United States. It says, when is America going to care as much about the deaths of innocent Palestinians? That sentiment runs very deep in a large part of the Metro Detroit area. It runs very deep in large parts of this country.
Do you think the White House is wise to that?
What you have seen, interestingly, is the spokesperson of this has been Barack Obama, who has been very articulate the last few weeks about America's failure for years.
But that's Barack Obama. Right. I mean, what about the current White House?
And so, but don't underestimate how connected the past administration and the current administration are. And so President Biden understands this, and it's a very complicated issue. He's going to have to take the steps to deal with it fairly, and he's going to be judged on how he does in the coming months.
So that was our very own John Sopel talking to Mayor of Detroit, Mike Duggan. And if you want to listen to that full interview, which I'm sure you do, that will be out on Wednesday. And I think it's just a little, as well as, of course, being a very interesting interview, I mean, I'm sure you'll agree with me, that it is a parable, a warning to any unsuspecting politician in any country, that if you see John Sopel either chairing an event or indeed on holiday in his flip-flops, shorts and sunglasses, that you are not safe, that it is entirely possible he will find you and he will interview, quite possibly, whether you like it or not.
You're both as bad as each other. I mean, that is a pot and a kettle. And I'm going to leave it to our audience to decide who's worse. We should just say that tomorrow, I was going to call him Donald Trump, John Sopel is meeting Nadine Dorris for a little sit-down chat about her new explosive new book.
And that will be out on Thursday. What a load of goodies we're giving everybody this week. Although I'm not sure you would have appreciated the Freudian slip of the confusion between John Sopel and Donald Trump. Easily confused. Both powerful men in their own respective ways.
Powerful men wearing very good suits. Yeah.
Well, have a safe flight home.
Bye for now.
And we'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.